All right. Well, Misha, Asim, Awais, welcome to the podcast for Making Studio, which is based out of the UK. And such a pleasure to actually be in the company of all three of you. And Makings, as you know, kind of resides in the creative cluster at the Birmingham Centre for Media and Cultural Research in England. And as part of their upcoming studio edition, we decided we're going to host this, what I think is a pretty terrific lineup for this podcast on unpacking masculinity in South Asia, And as we were chatting earlier, we talk a lot about feminism and kind of women's empowerment. And I think talking about masculinity, which is closely allied to that, is something I feel is deeply urgent and it's much too ignored. So I think this conversation is very closely allied to the talk on feminism. It's not like it's mutually exclusive. And I'm just so grateful to the three of you for, willing to be open, to be honest. And I have to say, to sort of almost embrace the vulnerability that surrounds these sorts of topics, and as Misha was saying earlier, just for us to have a kind of safe space to talk about things that I feel get hushed up too much. So as we've been saying earlier, this is very much a dialogue. It's very much a free-flowing exchange. I hope it's going to be like that. And it's kind of a platform just to talk about our experiences, our ideas, and kind of how we can think of making things change when it comes to toxic masculinity. So a very warm welcome to all three of you. Maybe I will start out with just a brief introduction for people who will be listening in. Not that any of you need that, but still. And I'll start with Misha. Misha, I guess you're tired of people saying, oh, she doesn't need an introduction. And I am going to go ahead and introduce you.
No, please do.
Thank you. Yeah. I think for me, Misha is an artist, period. And everything that she does, all the phenomenal hats that she wears, I think kind of get subsumed under that really versatile umbrella. She's an actress, she's a model, a singer, she's a mother, she's based out of Canada. And she's been part of films that are so close to my heart, like The Reluctant Fundamentalist. As everybody knows, she performs for Coke Studio and is known not least of all for this mesmerizing rendition that she did of Dashte Tanhai, and now more recently Boom Boom and Amrit. Amrit, I don't know, Asim and Awais, if you've heard it, but it's such a personal favorite of mine, and I've had it on a loop for a while. So in short, Misha, I guess my introduction for you is that you're so aspirational. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was very, very kind. Thanks.
No, absolutely. It comes from a space of complete honesty and thank you so much. Asim, welcome to the podcast. Fun fact, Asim and I went to school together in Karachi, not the same batch.
No way.
Yeah. So, definitely the same school. Yeah. And I don't think it would be a stretch, Asim, to say that in some ways, I think from the conversations I've had with you, we kind of share similar experiences about that time in our lives. And I'm not sure that was necessarily the majority opinion, but I think it's something that you and I kind of have in common. And I think it really adds to the wavelength that I share with Asim in this subtle but really powerful way. And, kind of about Asim, I suppose, unless you've been living under a rock, you know that Asim is an independent filmmaker who's based out of the UK, but is often in Pakistan for filming. His most recent project was Churails, this 10-part web series that released last year. And it's just, where do I begin about Churails, Asim? Obviously, it's a revolutionary show. It's tackled a lot of the themes that we are going to be speaking about today. And I think what really excited me was the kind of press coverage Churails got, like Hindustan Times calling it a bewitching tale, Film Companion referring to it as a haunting ballet of witches. I loved that. And of course, as a lot of people know, Asim's debut feature was Cake, which released in 2018. And for me, I've said this to Asim, but I felt it was very much a watershed for Pakistani cinema. It has been. I felt it was kind of our Dil Chahta Hai moment. And again, the kind of acclaim it got, The Guardian finding it far richer and worldlier than anything previously observed coming down the Khyber Pass. Talk about putting Pakistan on the map for the right reasons. And they're usually so tight-lipped. So welcome, Asim. Asim has a BSc in economics from LSE, a master's in global cinema from SOAS. He studied at the London Film Academy. And here's another surprising and really fun fact. Asim worked in finance, in banking, if I'm not mistaken, Asim, for several years before starting filming. And we're really going to unpack that in that conversation. So a very warm welcome to you, Asim.
Thank you. Thank you for that intro.
And we have Awais Khan joining us. Awais is a storyteller. He's the author of 2 novels. His debut novel was In the Company of Strangers, which was published by Simon & Schuster. The book killed, and it's out as an audiobook now as well, isn't it, Awais, by Isis Audio?
Yes, it is.
Fantastic. And well, Awais is, I think what's even more exciting is Awais's new forthcoming book, No Honor, is slated for release by Orenda Books this summer. And that is so exciting. But amongst all the marvelous things that Awais does, I think what's really close to my heart is the Creative Writing Academy that Awais has set up in Pakistan. Misha and Asim, I don't know if you know about that, but it is really something that is revolutionizing the literary landscape in Pakistan. And it's something which we just, I feel, don't have enough of. It's something that's one of the many hats Awais wears. He's spoken at Durham University, at the American University of Dubai, the Canadian University of Dubai. He's been on BBC World Service, Voice of America, amongst a host of other media engagements. And Awais is a graduate of the University of Western Ontario, so closer to you, Misha.
And that's right.
Yeah, and he's an alumni of the Faber Academy. But foremost, Awais is a dear friend, and he's someone who is forging so much solidarity amongst Pakistani writers. It's a community that can feel so isolating, and I've had first-hand experience of that this past year. So thank you so much, Awais, and a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you so much, Sabah, for this wonderful introduction.
No, absolutely. Well, I guess I want to begin with talking about, so we're talking about toxic masculinity, as everybody knows. And I think I kind of wanted to start with this idea of, the whole boys don't cry and the problem with expressing when it comes to men all over the world. But I think specifically in Pakistan, maybe it's something that's amplified to a larger degree. And we almost see expressing and emoting as running quite contradictory to male DNA in our society. So I think, Asim, maybe I'll start with you, not to put you on the spot, but maybe I'll start with you. And I think it would be really insightful if the first part is sort of more personal and almost anecdotal in a sense. And I'm going to ask you to take us into almost an inner life, if you will, as we wrestle with and try to pick apart what it means to be a man in Pakistan. So, I'm talking bro code, I'm talking boys club, I'm talking alpha machoism. And I guess the question is, when was the last time that you feel you expressed without having to be tight-lipped or having to censor or hold back? Like, I mean, I don't know. And you could take expressing to mean anything you like, from like crying to something milder. But when was the last time that you think you really didn't have to censor yourself?
Okay. So I think I come from mine's a slightly complicated mix. Where I came, my dad was very, very gentle. And I think we've discussed this about that I kind of never saw him as this alpha male. And he was my mother was the dominant one. She was, more, my father was always like trying to calm everything down and be cool and about it. And I kind of saw that growing up, and my family was conservative. There was a big generation gap. They were older, but I think perhaps the generation gap was so big that kind of helped that they hadn't fallen into this trap that I think came a generation after, about bifurcating boys and girls and what advertising brought in its wake with the blue and the pink and all of that stuff. That kind of really didn't exist for my family. So if I wanted a car, I got a car. But if I wanted a doll, I got a doll, and there was no question. And I had both. I had things. There was no difference here. And it was only when I entered, I would say, the wider world outside my nuclear family, when I was, I remember going to the US once. I was 7 years old, and I was at Toys R Us, and I picked up a doll, and there was an uncle there. He was like, what is he doing? What is he doing? Why is he picking up a doll? Like, put it back. And I was like, and I had never heard someone speak, like, I'm just only 7 and I remember this, but I've never heard anyone, because my parents had never addressed me like that. My sisters had never addressed me like that. So I think that moment really stayed with me. Someone telling me that I could not have something just because of my gender, or just because of, I didn't even comprehend that at that time, but it's something that stayed with me. And kind of course with, so as a child, I would openly cry because I was never told that I could not cry. But as soon as I was out, I was in the school environment. I was seeing other boys and how they had been raised. And I was like, okay, why are they aligning me more with girls? Why are they thinking that I should be in the girl group and I should be hanging out with them, and I should be, because I'm not macho and I'm not aggressive, and sort of you kind of learn over time. And the thing is, even though I was in that environment, nuclear environment, where I was free to have toys that I wanted and free to express, and free to listen to Bollywood, and if I wanted to dance on a song, they let me dance, and if I wanted to copy the moves, I was allowed to copy it without it being a fuss. But the school environment puts such a big toll on you, I think, that you adjust and you don't even know that you're adjusting, and the way you are fitting yourself, and when the masks are coming on, it's so slow and gradual.
Conditioning.
The conditioning, but it's so, you don't realize. I mean, like, I'm 40 years old and I'm still unpacking the conditioning of like 25 years ago, and that's the kind of impact it kind of has. I'm very conscious with my son now, how I am raising him. But still, it's not, one small thing from someone else he'll hear, because those opinions still exist, and then he'll ask me, oh, why is this color not for girls? Is this color not for boys? And I'm gonna. But it's like you're always fighting this war against the society and what the norm is, because they keep hearing other things from other people, and you can't control what other people are going to say. So it becomes...
I find myself toying with the idea of, and we've had the children at home a lot, because there's been like on again, off again, virtual schooling, online schooling, homeschooling, and because it's happening, I just sometimes really like find myself fantasizing about just not sending them back to school and just carrying on their education at home. One has to be very devoted and brave for that. Obviously, aapko khud bahut, like you have to be disciplined and super, it's a long-term serious commitment for a parent. But I do really feel like I mean, I would be, if I could muster up the courage to do that, I would do it, because there are notions and it's interesting, because you also want them to sort of integrate with society, and whatever lies ahead. So you don't want them to sort of like, grow up in this bubble of what you're perceiving is how it should be, because essentially that's not in fact how it is out there. So it takes all kinds to make the world. Lekin, it's interesting, the toxic masculinity thing of, like, for example, here they have a pink shirt day. The children have a pink shirt day in school, where the children came back and they told me what it meant and why it was the pink shirt day. And it was because some kid a number of years ago showed up to school in a pink shirt and got bullied for it. Wow. And the one of the children who saw this happening went home and started calling up all the kids he knew, and it kind of just sort of like spread out, and they started amongst themselves telling everyone to wear a pink shirt to school the next day. Wow. And then everybody showed up in pink shirts the following day. And since then, in Canada, there is a day which is called Pink Shirt Day, and in all the schools across the province, or maybe the country, I'm not sure, there's Pink Shirt Day, and it's about raising awareness as far as bullying is concerned, gender stereotyping, and all of these things. So, and my kids come home and they laugh about it. like this time, my son came home and he said, you know, the bullies were wearing pink shirts today. I don't get it. Where we get it?
Yeah.
So yeah, you know, it's
no, thank
it's
you.
It's a big conversation for parents to have.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know, Nisha, that's a great segue into, I wanted to bring you in here anyway, because I want to definitely get to the part about, because I know you have a son and a daughter. That's right. And
yes.
So, I mean, so that's part of what I want to ask you about. But even before that, I almost want to back up for a minute and say, you know, I mean, I'm curious to ask you about what sort of male presence did you have around you as you were growing up? You know, kind of your, I don't want to say formative years, because yes, in a sense, those are formative years, but then, you know, formative years stay with you even later. But what was that environment like, specifically with regard to, you know, men and boys around you? And I guess tied to that, you have a son now, you know, and I wonder, what are some of the aspects that you want to hold on to, and what are some of the aspects that you want to discard, you know, when you think about bringing him up? And I guess it's an interesting juxtaposition, because you've spent time in Pakistan and you're now in Canada. So I mean, I'd love for you to talk us through that a little bit.
You know, I had this realization very late in life, more like a reality check sort of thing. Which was that, oh my God, the rest of the masses or the rest of society, not that I didn't have like worldly experiences growing up in Lahore, but maybe in my own sort of like privileged way, I took it for granted to an extent that a basic core values, and this is, I'm talking about like, you know, it kind of started to dawn upon me maybe around that, you know, things are indeed very unhealthy out there. And then I started to sort of which basically, you know, I'm saying to reflect the fact that growing up in my house, it was like a radically feminist house. Radically feminist. It was a matriarchy, honestly, a little bit, you know, if you must. And my grandfather, who was the father figure I had growing up, I mean, you can look him up. He was a very acclaimed writer, journalist, activist, and he was just in a league of his own. He was a contemporary of Faiz Saab and Ayyar Rahman, and just the kind of these were the people I saw sitting in my TV lounge all my childhood, and I didn't know at that time what they stood for. I didn't fully understand. I was a child, but I absorbed their sort of like, they had an aura, and their conversations and their energy and their just like, and I understood like soon enough, obviously. So that's the kind of, you know, those are the kind of influences that lit like directly in my first-hand experience. I mean, Faiz Ahmed Faiz named me, and my nana, he used to you know, have like very very philosophical conversations with us, and there was no, he was the one who would wake up and make the breakfast. And when he got married, my nani she came to his house after the rukhsati in a burqa, not a shuttlecock burqa, just like the churails wala burqa. And she you know, she married into his family when they got married, and the first thing he did was he took it off and took it into the fields behind their house and burnt it.
Wow.
And he said, okay, so now that's that, because she wasn't wearing it out of choice. She was just told to wear it from adolescence onwards, and then she just carried on with it, and she hadn't really thought about it. So he was the male influence in my life, and a big privilege, really. I mean, I really can't explain, but yes, when you expect the same sort of like, you have to push back, right? I saw him push back. And I guess that's what we're trying to do in our various sort of like mediums and capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you think about your son today, Misha, what's that experience of mothering him now?
It's lovely. It's lovely. I don't honestly, I am sort of like, I forget that I'm mothering my son right now and I'm mothering my daughter right now. So that's kind of been the thing of like, they're the same to me. They're just two children and I want to do the best that I can, guiding them and raising them. And that's where I want it to be. I don't want to parent them both differently. It really doesn't need to be that way. Essentially, they should learn like how to be decent human beings.
Yeah.
Regardless of gender. So yeah, that's how. I mean, I just, I think the first thing to do is not think about it that way. I have to make an extra effort with the boy, and the girl will be. I just feel like, and this is what I don't know if I did it deliberately, but this is what I have sort of seemed to. That's the groove in the house. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, no, that's great. Bess, I want to bring you in, and we've been talking obviously about, this whole surround sound of society and around masculinity, all of this. And I know that it can be a difficult conversation, especially for men. And I think this is why I wanted Asim and you on the call today as well. Because there can be fear and trepidation. And also this fear of, like, as Asim was outlining for us during school as well, like, just this idea of what are other people doing, how much do we need to conform to that? Are you almost, and this again, Wes, you write about sort of privileged classes as much as you write about somebody in a village. And I think the thing is that we probably all agree that this is something that operates almost agnostic to class in Pakistani society, and you're almost less manly if you're too emotional, whether it's the woman who works in my mother's house, her husband, or whether it's my partner, and then this idea of that's such a girl thing. And I guess, this is like the more anecdotal and personal part of the conversation. And I'm curious to ask if you've had any experience with being, where an experience or experiences where you felt forced to almost repress or kind of gag an emotion, just because it would not conform to this male stereotype that kind of Pakistani society boxes us in. There's this sense of being a strong, stoic man. I see it, even with my own partner. So I'm not sort of trying to have this conversation pretending like we've suddenly evolved to a point beyond that. And I find it problematic, but I'm curious to ask what your experience has been around this,
Thank you. First of all, I'd just like to say that I could listen to you guys talk all day long because you all talk so well, speak so well. But I think being a Pakistani, every single day has been a pressure to conform. I would be lying if I said that there wasn't any pressure. I think I've always been a very sensitive person, especially back when I was a child, and that really, really got me bullied. So I was relentlessly bullied as a child in school. To the point where I was absolutely miserable. I think middle school was a very difficult time for me because whatever I did, even if I did try to conform, it just didn't meet those expectations. I mean, my family was always very supportive. Yes, they're very nice, but they're not like, they still believe in that boys don't cry thing. So I mean, it's not, the pressure didn't come from there, but it was in school that I was absolutely miserable. But and I think that continued until high school, after which I sort of buried myself in studies, and and then obviously with O levels, A levels, nobody really has any time to bully anyone because you're also focused on studies. So I think that sort of died out. But yeah, after that it was education, higher studies, and then after returning from there was this pressure to join the family business. Someone was pressuring me to join banking. So there, I was like being pulled in every single direction I could think of, except the direction I wanted to go in. So nobody told me that, yes, if you want to write a book, go ahead and take a creative writing master's or bachelor's and go ahead and write a book. So I was never told that. And yeah, so I repressed that for many years. I did the family business. I did stuff people wanted and expected me to do, and I kept doing it for, I don't know, age 25 or 26, after which I really thought that, I'd love to try this. And yeah, at that time my parents did support me, and I went ahead and took this paper course, and that sort of changed my life. That introduced me to writing and stuff. So now I'm at a point where I do other stuff as well, but I also do writing because that really grounds me, that really makes me who I am. So, but yeah, I think even today, I think at age 34, I'm 34 years old. There isn't a single day that goes by where I don't feel like I'm being pulled in a certain direction against my will. So I think being a Pakistani, everyone can relate to that. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, and Misha, that's part of a big reason why I wanted Asim and Awais here today, because they're both kind of, and I say this I cringe so much as I say this, Asim, but it's sort of, I had this on my list of things to ask, and Awais has brought it up beautifully to say that both of you, in some ways, definitely not from the lens that the people on this conversation view it, but you're probably not unaware that even Asim, you, the profession that, you've kind of transitioned into, and that's why in the intro I said we're going to unpack that, because you were doing like what everybody would expect a Pakistani man to do, right? Like you were in the financial services industry. And I tell you, like in the best of ways, I did a double take when you made that transition, because I was like, this is exactly the kind of signal, a double take in a really good way. Because I was just like, oh my gosh, like that is what real courage looks like. And it kind of allies to what Nisha was saying about pushing back kind of personally, but also at a broader scale. And we've chatted about this earlier, but this sense of when you were putting Cake together, for that matter, even the films that happened before Cake, the smaller films, when you were kind of experimenting, when you did the stuff at SOAS as well, there were no guarantees at that point. Guardian ke ye quotes nahi the, tumhare paas to say that, oh my gosh, okay, suddenly like I've got these stars, suddenly I've arrived. And I think it's hindsight is always 2020 to say, oh, of course, this was my kind of calling and I wanted to do it. But I guess I'm really curious to ask you that, what has it felt like, similar to Awais, to kind of make this switch and almost visit a terrain, a professional terrain that is, the exception rather than the rule? And kind of how have you worked and negotiated with this gender surround sound, which carries with us so much of the times? That's part of it. And the other part that I'm curious to ask Awais and you is, once you got onto these job kind of switches or career lines or paths, has there been stereotyping attached to that as well? So maybe talk me through the decision and then kind of what ensued.
Sure. I mean, like, the pushback seems really scary just before it's happened. You're like, oh my God, what is this going to look like? But I think once it's happened, it's easier. But it took a long time. There is the set pressure, the tangible pressure that we feel, but then there's this intangible, this respect for parents, this love for parents, this not wanting to disappoint them, and this pedestal that we put our parents in. That for me was much stronger. You see, so there was never, say, like my mom would say this, which is absolutely true. She never told me what I needed to do, and but it was all there. You know what is expected and what is not expected, and frankly, school doesn't help. I mean, I was at what they call the best school, and I was at Grammar. They don't direct you towards arts. They don't direct you towards anything that is so the sciences were not working for me. I went and did economics. I got a really good job, and I did that job for 10 years because it paid well. It was just that. you know. And it was only somehow when I was turning 30, when I was having a very early midlife crisis, and I got married then. It was really my wife who kind of pushed me, and she was like, do what you've got to do, make yourself happy, and see and figure it out and take those risks. And I was like, Acha, financially, I can take that risk now, because 10 years of banking has to live up to something that I have some safety net that I can experiment and do short films for 3-4 years. I think in a way it worked out really well, but I think you just need someone who kind of believes in you, which in my case was my wife. And also just that you have to just take that risk at some point and plunge, because once you plunge, I think it all kind of eases out itself. It's that just first hurdle of actually voicing it to someone that you need to do this. And I had to, that difficult conversation, even like, I think 5 minutes into that conversation with my mom, I was fine. But that getting up to have that conversation took so many years to say, I'm unhappy, I want to create, I want to write. That's what fulfills me. I want to direct. I need to do it. That's the only way. And frankly, that when that happened, everything fell into place. I became more aware of myself. I became more, the person you want to speak to today. That person did not exist in his 20s because he was too busy doing a job and living a life that was not his. I have not, to be honest, since I've come into the role, I've not felt any stereotype, but also because I've attracted people very similar to me. I've been very, very lucky that I have not yet had to go to TV channels and work with them, or do, high budget commercial films, or do TV drama. I haven't mingled with that. I'm more on the indie side. I'm dealing with people who are very, very aligned with my thinking, who kind of, younger people who I look up to, and I'm like, man, I wish I was like that in my 20s. I wish I had that confidence, that ability, that fluidity in the way they think and the way they grasp, which I didn't have then. So I think I've been very lucky since I've found my footing in the industry to be with people that are very, very similar.
Yeah. Nisha, were you going to say something?
I just wanted to say what he was talking about was resistance, that anxious anticipation of right before you take some sort of a leap. And I think it comes from mental barriers. It's usually some sort of belief, or some sort of something you're holding on to without possibly realizing it, some notion, and you're about to let it go. It's like some sort of false safety net just because of familiarity, and you just let it go. Beliefs are like that, and they come from conditioning, and they thrive on fear, and we hold on to things because of that, leaving a job that gives us cushioning and familiarity and sort of stability, or just hanging out with the same 4 people because it's there's comfort in the sameness of something. Any kind of leap, I think, it has its little share of sort of like stress, which it's the ego mind. And it's basically just doing its job and trying to sort of hold you back from trying new things under the guise of keeping you safe.
Yeah. And Misha, I wanna talk to you more about, even if I start out, we started out with saying toxic masculinity, and it's almost kind of become like a buzzword in some senses, and I want to really kind of delayer it a bit. And I guess I'm really interested to talk to all of you, but maybe starting with Misha about its relationship to power, right? Because I feel it's hard to disentangle this idea of the kind of masculinity we grew up with seeing, in a place like Pakistan. And there often seems to be a kind of aggression that is associated with toxic masculine behavior. And I think what I find really interesting, because he writes about people across echelons, not just in a particular socioeconomic bracket. And I think what I find interesting is that you see this power dynamic kind of playing out. I've seen it personally. Asim, I'm sure you have to in corporate corridors. You'll see it within the confines of someone's bedroom. You'll obviously, Misha, see it within your own industry as well, and across different industries. And I guess I'm just curious to kind of bring the conversation to talking about what has your experience been as a woman spending time in Pakistan, as an artist, as someone who's continues to be in the limelight so much. Have you been at the receiving end of it, I suppose, professionally, personally, whatever? And I mean, what has that experience felt like? And has it changed you at all? I guess I'm interested in that.
It's just kind of morphed and evolved and gone and turned into a more sophisticated, it has a bit more sheen, it's less crude, it's better camouflaged. We still have a lot of just no real understanding of it, even when, I mean, you must have seen there's so many people in the industry who we get to see answering or attempting to answer this question of, are you a feminist? What do you think about feminism? And they just, I feel like they are replying from a mildly panic-stricken sort of defensive place of internalized patriarchy and toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
That is where I feel like they are just, like prisoners of that internalized. I don't even want to say they. I think in some ways, in some situations, everybody sort of like has to check themselves and does fall prey to it. It's very sneaky. It's very sneaky, just like, Asim was saying earlier, the conditioning and the little things that you absorb and pick up on and stuff. So yeah, in the industry, toxic masculinity, so to operate and function in the industry from very early on, I think what I seemed to have done was really puffed up my feathers and sort of made myself look, and I literally used costume and couture and makeup and a lot of my sort of like the glam aspect of my persona, I've begun to understand later on, was coming from a need to sort of, how in the jungle, like in the wild, when you want to be intimidating and sort of give people a warning signal, you basically, that's what you do. You open up your tail feathers and sort of like just appear to be bigger and scarier and more dramatic than you really are. And that's what I was doing. I was kind of like overcompensating to without understanding it, to basically just survive amongst the toxic masculinity. Because otherwise you're in the creative industry, but you're just 100% of the time and the day just being an activist, and that's very exhausting. But having said that, all of this would be very, I mean, I started understanding it later, if that makes sense. That this is what I was doing and this is where it was coming from. Yeah.
That's what I was going to say, that I think what's really powerful is the fact that you've had that introspection, right? And that reflection to say, I mean, not everybody would be at that stage. And I think that happens over a period of time, but just the fact that you're able to look back at that and kind of process it is such an important step. And thank you for sharing that. Vaiz, I want to, so we've kind of laid out the landscape now, and, we've spoken about what this looks like across industries and genres and all of that. And I want to kind of move a little bit and wrap with kind of talking about resistance, and we've touched upon this earlier, but, in Pakistan's context, when we think about pushing back, and I guess the reason for doing this is that I also want to talk a little bit about can we be hopeful? Can we invite people to eventually imagine a less toxic world, everywhere, but especially in Pakistan? And so I think registering our protest is very important, but kind of the question of where from here. And so, Wes, I spoke about this earlier, that your writing kind of is not confined to a particular area. And I guess the broader kind of abstract question I have for you is that, do you see literature and storytelling and kind of the novel as one form of it, of course, but then even beyond that, I mean, Asim's a storyteller too, Misha's a storyteller, and we all are in our own ways, right? Like kind of agnostic to medium. And I'm wondering if you think that writing can help to strip some of those boxes that we try and put men into. Can it instigate men to think more freely? And do you think literature has a role to play? And if so, is that something you hope to do with your writing eventually?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think literature sort of transcends all sorts of borders and boundaries. So why not? I honestly think that, yes, that is definitely the way to go. As far as pushing back is concerned, in Pakistan, the problem is that one thing is that you're pushing back against the stereotypes. But then with creative arts, you're at a disadvantage in any case, because Pakistan doesn't offer you the kind of opportunities you want. So you're basically at a loss no matter what you do. So I think it takes a lot of courage to follow your dream in Pakistan, especially because I speak from experience. I wanted to get published, all of that. But when I wrote my book, I finished it and I was like, where are the publishers? So there weren't any publishers in Pakistan, no agents either. So I had to look at India and the UK in order to get noticed. And it was such a hard thing to do because there's so much competition. There are like thousands and thousands of writers who are approaching the same agents. Why would anyone want to read a work from a Pakistani author who's unknown? So it took like an arm and leg to get noticed by an agent. And once I had an agent, I turned out that finding a publisher is even harder because you tend to get rejected all the time. So there were edits after edits after edits. And then eventually it found a publisher. And even then, it's not guaranteed that you'll find success. So I still get people who ask me in Pakistan that how much do you earn from your writing? What kind of royalties are you getting? So I'm like, is this a question that you'll ask anyone who's doing a job, that kitni tankhwah? I mean, why do people ask me that? So I feel very uncomfortable when I'm asked that, what exactly have you earned in royalties? So that again, I think is stereotype. And but yeah, I this is what I tell everyone, even my students, that if this can happen for me, it can happen for anyone at all. I mean, anything is possible. So yeah, I think literature is the way forward, hopefully. And what I write.
Yeah, no, sorry. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No. I was just saying that what I write is basically again another thing that a lot of people, especially in Pakistan, make the mistake of thinking that what's written in a book is the author's personal beliefs. So that is another stereotype that you have to contend with, because it is not true. I mean, your characters are not you as a person. I mean, if you're writing about a villain, it doesn't mean you're the villain yourself in real life. So that is another thing that we need to unravel a little bit here. But yeah, to answer your question, literature is the way forward.
And I was also going to just ask you that with the institute that you've got, what is the gender breakup? I guess I would be curious. And again, maybe I shouldn't be asking, but I'm asking out of complete ignorance and curiosity.
We have 80% women enrolled for my courses. So I've got very few men. But the best part is that that's what I'm proud of, that I've given aspiring writers in Pakistan a platform, because not everyone can afford these expensive courses abroad, and people need to have a place where they can express themselves. And so many of my students have gone on to get published. Some of them have published books, some of them have gone published in magazines and newspapers, and most of them female. So that makes me very happy.
Of course. And also, just the last thing I wanted to ask you, Wes, was that when you spoke to us a little bit earlier about this, but when you made that decision to say, there's the family business, there's tens of other things happening, it's so messed up, but there's this sense of who's the marriageable guy, who's the responsible, lucrative, and there's this prototype that you have, which again, I feel sick even speaking of, but it's kind of true, right? I mean, banker, engineer, whatever. And I guess I'm also just wanting to ask, was there family pushback, like from your immediate or extended networks, when you did decide to kind of, what I would say is take the road less traveled, right? That's just the truth.
Never from my parents, actually. My parents, I mean, I have to say in public, my parents have never stopped me from pursuing writing. So they were always very supportive, even though they knew that, maybe this is not going to make a lot of money here. But they've always been supportive. But yes, as far as extended family is concerned, I can't say the same, because yes, there was a lot of pressure, and there was a lot of, making fun of me all the time, and, asking me insensitive questions. Especially when I was looking for an agent, I was literally, every single person used to come up to me and they're like, "Why isn't the book published yet? Why isn't?" I mean, they never understood the process.
Yeah.
And I just,
Yeah.
after a while, I stopped bothering to answer, because nobody understood. So what's the point? So yeah, but I think my parents and my immediate family have always been very supportive. So I'm thankful to them for that.
Yeah.
Extended family को बहुत शौक होता है just to extended families everywhere just need to go so.
I mean, I can't. ज़्यादा बोल भी नहीं सकता. I don't want to piss them off, but yeah.
Safe space, yes.
Yeah.
But no, I completely understand what you're saying. And Misha, I wanna, we see placards in Pakistan. We've seen the Mera Jism Meri Marzi. We've also seen lesser visible forms of resistance to toxic masculinity that maybe don't get spoken about so much, but kind of we see them as more niche, but they're definitely maybe quietly fierce in their own ways. It doesn't always have to be loud or someone being, like you said, an activist in the way that we know these words. And yet, I mean, this is my personal perspective, but I feel like yet there's a lot of work to be done. And one of my pet peeves is I'm just not sure how much of this is trickling down. I mean, people sitting in an air-conditioned drawing room having these conversations is important. But then I'm also mindful of the fact that the four of us are a sliver of Pakistani society, So it's not to downsize any conversation that one would have, but I guess I want to ask you, given that so many people in Pakistan still believe in this "boys don't cry" kind of slogan, what needs to happen for the needle to move? I mean, what sort of future do you see for your son in a place like Pakistan? Let me ask, and for your daughter, because again, we started the conversation with saying it's not as if this conversation is mutually exclusive or separate from the conversation around patriarchy or women's issues.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I'd love to hear how you see this going forward.
Practically, it would be very, very difficult for them to come back and sort of like take that move in their stride, because they will sort of they would have to go through a big culture shock. It would be a big culture shock for them. On gender issues, yes. On the other day, I was sitting in, I don't know what, folding some laundry, and I called out to my husband, and I said, "Could you please, our son was hungry, and I said, could you please get dinner started, because these kids are hungry." And he turned around and he went towards the kitchen, and my daughter turned around and said to me, "I'm so glad Baba's not a sexist." And I was like, she just turned 10. I didn't teach her this word. But and I looked at her and I said, "Yes, Jahnavi, yes, I'm so glad that he's not as well." And she's like, like usually dads turn around and be like, "No way, I don't know anything. Where are the things in the kitchen and what?" And she started giving me examples, and I was like, where is she even picking this up from? This generation has literally been literally in lockdown. They're like, they're at home. The kids right now, they're not having a very social experience as far as life is concerned. In the very formative years. So the domestic sort of like thing, the dynamics, the examples at home are becoming even more, I don't know, they've always been, but like it's just become an even bigger non-stop 24/7 thing. The energy in the house, the dynamics of the family, the role stereotypes or lack thereof. And if they were to come back, I don't know. I don't know. I really don't know. I myself, I was having a bit of a hard time. I moved out of choice. I moved voluntarily. So because of freedom of expression.
Yeah.
Freedom of expression and freedom of authenticity and don't get me wrong, I often wonder if the answer to striving to be yourself is to get up and move away from where your identity is tied with. It's a big question.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have the answers. This is just something I felt like I needed to do, to see.
Sure.
Yeah. So yeah, but like, I mean, toxic masculinity is a state of mind and a state of being, and it has nothing to do with geographical locations. And the pushback continues. And the digital sort of like mediums of expression and platforms and the online spaces are very helpful as far as just political views are concerned, and dialogue is concerned, and it's not something that, you know, like our parents' generation, they have a generation. Sometimes when I'm talking to someone who is from that time, I feel like they have a generational blind spot. Like they are very earnest and open and flexible to understanding what is being said, as far as feminist politics, rape culture, what being a rape apologist means, what all is, you know, is by definition a rape apology. I had this conversation with someone recently, and it was and I had vowed to myself that I would not sort of like, you know, I would remain patient, and in the end I realized that it's baqaida, it's a generational blind spot. It's just such a you just keep unraveling. It's all connected.
I completely hear you on the generational blind spot. I mean, it's 100% true, and I think we experience it again. Like, I'm very aware of not trying to have this conversation with this feigned attempt of, oh, we've sorted it all out, because I mean, I would see this within our own networks at some point, or have seen it. So that's absolutely true. And of course, with your kids, I would imagine that. I feel a bit of that in the UAE, so I can't even imagine how much that would get amplified. Although I haven't visited Canada, but from what I understand, they really do live out this idea of freedom of expression and kind of, you know, authentic presentation of self. So I think that was probably a really good move. And you continue to do your work, so that kind of tells the story and the resistance that you want to convey, right? I mean, Aves, you need to check out Amrit. It is mind-blowing.
I've seen it.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed it.
Oh, you've already, right? Yeah, it's just so powerful.
Thank you.
That's not to embarrass you with praise, Misha, but it's just I can't help but talk about Amrit.
No, thank you so much. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask him. I want to wrap with just bringing the conversation back to you and kind of, you know, just on the same trajectory that we've been on for the last, you know, bit. And, you know, we're almost at the end of the podcast, but leave us with some clues for where to begin. I mean, how do we, you know, as I was asking Misha, how does one start imagining a different world? You know, of course, it's not something that'll happen quickly or rapidly, and I don't think it should happen necessarily quickly, because these things have a certain path that they must take. But, you know, I mean, what do you think it's going to take for change to ignite? And I guess you're someone who's doing this remarkably well in your own space, both personally and professionally. And what is it going to take for more men to start focusing on this inner scorecard rather than constantly operating on the behest of log kya kahenge. You know, like you were saying, you went to KGS, you went to like the absolute best of, you know, the creme de la creme kind of institution, and yet in your own way there was resistance from there. Of course, I know that there is conditioning, there's socializing that leaves a deep sort of indelible imprint, but how do we make things like ghairat in this masculine context, a toxic masculinity context, how do we make them extinct? And I know that's a big question. So
yeah, no, and it's also, I don't want to be bleak at the end of the podcast, you know.
Misha and Avais will save us, but I know you're not going to be bleak. So it's fine.
No, I have my share of bleak things I haven't said yet. Don't worry.
I don't know where you go. You know what people like Misha and I and Oais, we do. Yes, they move the needle, but they're small drops in this huge ocean. And presiding over these oceans are people much more powerful than us. How do you, or it's TV shows like Artugul, like there is a lot for every, like 10 people who saw Churels, thousands saw Artugul, you know. You know, my kid's seen it. He takes out a sword now. He's gotten into swords and stuff. He likes it. And I'm powerless in front of all of that, because it's just, I can't. So it's what do you do? I don't know what you do. I mean, it needs to be a concerted effort. It needs to be a lot more of voices. And I feel like, and at least diversity in its sense should be celebrated, right? You know, what was Churels? It was a paid for subscription based 18 plus show. You still made such a hoo-ha about it. You tried to censor it. You tried to put new laws into place for it. I mean, like, for things that you should be active, you've not been active for decades. Suddenly, overnight, you can come up with laws to you know, to curtail digital. I mean, like, so it's just they're so focused on the wrong things that it's, you know, and then what happens? You kind of you fuel it, right? What stuff like that fuels it. Our audience, our viewers remain public already is on the cusp of this thing that they just need a little bit of a dhakka, and they always fall into this puddle of mess. So I don't know, to be honest. I don't want to be bleak, but I don't, you know, some kind of effort in the education sector. I don't know. I don't think we have any kind of, you know, understanding of gender in school. We don't have any, even we didn't. I don't remember having any kind of education. I don't know, maybe I was wrong, but maybe I'm wrong. But within Pakistan,
we had women's studies, but I was in an all-girls school, and it was run by very like senior feminists anyway. I was in Lahore Grammar School, and you know, the board of directors of the Lahore Grammar School are actually like WAF members, and all very senior feminists from like the first women's movement back during Zia's time, and maybe even later. So we had women's studies, and I remember the teacher used to be her class and her presence and the way she looked and the things she said. I used to like, there used to be literal hearts flying out of my eyes when she used to come and teach us that 1 hour a week, women's studies. I don't even remember, they didn't make it very political because we were young. I'm talking about like grade 6, 7. But it left a huge mark on, huge mark. And it was just like, you know, I always used to think, oh my God, I want to be like Mrs. Rahman when I grow up. You know, I had that kind of thing, just because that was my first, out of my immediate social circle, network of family, friends, everyone at home, and the values in which I was nestled. That class was the first space where I felt resonance outside of my little world and upbringing and background and like just domestic environment. It was the first time in school. So there was some I was like, okay, there's some representation in the outside world of the values that I take for granted, basically. Sure. And you know, and I think that was so long ago, and now they're just like, you know, I don't know if you guys know, today some picture of Newton and all these memes about, it was hilarious. But the Punjab Board of Education or something, they were basically okaying curriculum, and there was a picture of Newton, and Newton used to wear his hair long, or probably a wig, like an old, you know, and they wrote to the schools and the publishers and said कि जी ये इस इन खातून के ऊपर दुपट्टा डालें, और वो आइजैक न्यूटन की तस्वीर है. This happened today. So I don't know what's happening. I mean, yes, we are drops in the ocean, and the ocean is polluted, and we just you know, like I also don't want to be bleak, so I focus on what I can create. That's the capacity that I hold. That's the space that I can hold for beauty and a dialogue, and just sort of like maybe unlocking some, or trying to unlock some levels of consciousness and awareness, and lead by example. Bas, that's it. That's what we can do. Sometimes I even feel like maybe it's not such a great thing to be liked or watched as many times as Earth the World. I'm not hating on the show. I haven't seen it. I wouldn't know what to say. But what I mean is, you know, it's almost a red flag when you have those kinds of numbers in a place like Pakistan loving what you do. Does that make sense?
It does, but it shouldn't be, though. That's what has to change.
It
right?
shouldn't.
Those
it
things
shouldn't.
Loved in that capacity. That is what I'm bleak about. When are those numbers going to shrink? And because it really shouldn't. Because we are very we mold very quickly to the commercial, to the more public thing. You know, whether it's mainstream cinema, and whether it is, you know, and our mainstream cinema is very misogynistic. It has very crude jokes. You know, some of the films that have done really, really well, if you sit down and just analyze them, you're like, these jokes are just not right for an audience. And of course, we don't have a certification, so everyone brings their toddlers and brings their kids, and so you have very, very young kids watching these films. And same thing for TV shows. You know, you give something a tappa of a national, your terrestrial channel, you're showing a show on that, a foreign show, and it's approved. You know, it's you know, again, I've only seen clips, and it might be a great show, but the idea is that it is about very masculine, very alpha figures. This much I do know. It is about, you know, crusading against other religions and stuff like that. So it's one of those things that doesn't really bring harmony. Right now, all we can do is bring harmony in whatever way we can, because we are so divisive anyway. We hate on other religions, we hate on other genders, we hate on everything that's an other. Like, that's just a Pakistani thing, you know. And that has to go. The acceptance of other kinds of peoples, I think that's really important, and media does have to play a role in that. Individuals, I don't know how much we can do, but you know, some kind of a concerted effort from the top would help.
Yeah.
But you know, Asim, what you've said. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, no, Wes, please go ahead.
No, I just wanted to echo Asim and Misha in saying that we can do this through our work. Like I tried to provoke outrage with my book, In the Company of Strangers, that, you know, things like misogyny and domestic abuse and all went on right under our noses. And so yeah, we can provoke outrage. But also I really liked, not to sound bleak, but this is actually very positive, but what Misha said earlier, I think that is the way forward. That when you asked her about raising her children, and she said that she's raising them both the same way, I think there lies our answer as to how we can change society. And you're right, it won't happen overnight. So this is how it happens. So this is our answer. This is our way forward, I think. So yeah. So to end on a positive note.
Yeah, thank you.
I will absolutely, and it's so true as well. Thanks for actually bringing that back at the end of us, because I mean, when I heard Misha say it as well, even though I don't have a son, but just to hear that approach is just, I completely, I think it's so powerful and it's compelling in its own way. And, you know, Asim, I mean, maybe I'm biased to the work you do, but I guess what I'm saying is that we've spoken about this earlier as well, that of course, like, you're not looking to do the out and out Eid kind of number film or whatever, even though you probably could very well do it at this point. And I guess maybe because you're the one creating and you're so close to that work. But I do feel that as a consumer of it, it's definitely, you know, I mean, starting from how Misha's raising her kids to like something like Churels and Cake, and then, you know, Aves's book and Amrit, I think those are definitely sides of resistance. And yes, I don't think they make noise, or maybe they're not loud in the way that, you know, something that's clocking those other kinds of numbers is. But I just feel like what the three of you are doing, and this is exactly why, you know, I invited you to be on the podcast today, is deeply compelling. You know, and again, I think it's going to be a question of quality over quantity, but I think that's just the way movements happen. And you know, it's not going to be like a light bulb moment in a second. But you know, I just I want to thank the three of you so much, really, like from the bottom of my heart, because it's been such a special conversation for me. And not least of all because it's three people who I admire as artists, but more than that, just as human beings. I've said this to the three of you on different occasions, and so I thought very carefully about who do we want to have this chat with. And I really am not just saying this because you're here right now, but you're not rewriting your own kind of paths, but in a big way, it goes so much beyond your personal selves. I think each of your professional lives kind of illustrate how it's not just a 9 to 5. And, you know, the fact that you're unearthing these songs, you're daring to leave some kind of legacy. And I think, I really do feel, as someone who watches that from the outside, it takes a lot of courage and it takes a lot of comfort in your skin to do that. I just don't think in Pakistan we have enough people who are comfortable in their skin. So, you know, Misha, Asim, Aves, I only have the deepest gratitude that you've done this alongside myself tonight. And I hope it's a tiny step in the direction of, you know, creating and imagining, I don't know, a less frightful world. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your company, all three of you. I had a really, really good, this was a great conversation. Really loved it.
Like this, Misha, and Uwais.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Nice meeting you too, you three.
Yeah, good meeting you. Take care of yourself.